Oh, look, I mean, I think you're right as well about that youth factor because he brings something different to the table. I've got to say, Josh, it's interesting because it hasn't always been smooth sailing for JD Vance and Trump. He once called him America's Hitler, but here is JD Vance admitting that he was wrong about the former president.
I didn't think he was going to be a good president, Brett. He was a great president, and it's one of the reasons why I'm working so hard to make sure he gets a second term. I think you should. When you're wrong about something, you should change your mind and be honest with people about that fact.
Josh, is JD Vance a bit of a secret weapon almost because he's about to convert more people like he had to himself?
Yeah, I find that very relatable because it's very similar to my own trajectory. So back in 2016 in the Republican presidential primary, I was just graduating law school at the time. I was a very outspoken supporter at the time of Senator Ted Cruz's presidential campaign. And I actually got a shout out in his Iowa caucus victory speech. I was very active in the Ted Cruz campaign. And I also had a very harsh language for Donald Trump at that time. I don't think I literally called him America's Hitler, but there were many of us who were caught up in the moment. It was a very important presidential primary. It was a very important election in 2016. And like JD Vance and like so many others, I have been won over. Donald Trump had a very successful 4 years as president. Did he make mistakes? Sure. I would not have handled COVID-19 lockdowns and vaccines, for instance, the exact same way that he did. But by and large, he was an extraordinarily successful president. The world was very stable. It was peaceful. There were no major wars at that time. The economy was thriving. The black unemployment rate here in America reached its absolute lowest number in the entire history of that statistic. The economy was roaring. The stock market was soaring. I could go on and on here. So at this point, I mean, who cares? Really, seriously, who cares what you said 8 years ago? It matters whether or not you are a passionate supporter of the president's agenda right now, and JD Vance clearly is that.
Absolutely, completely agree. I mean, it's what matters now that counts for sure. Now, look, let's talk about the ridiculous and inflammatory rhetoric we've seen from Joe Biden and the Democrats that led to the attempt on Trump's life.
Donald Trump is a genuine threat to this nation. He's a threat to our freedom. He's a threat to our democracy. He's literally a threat for everything America stands for.
They fan the flames of political violence that are a threat to our personal rights. Most importantly, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, Trump is a threat to this nation.
And as we know, Biden also told donors, we're done talking about the debate. It's time to put Trump in a bullseye. But here is Joe Biden overnight having very public hallucinations, denying he engaged in such insightful rhetoric.
Have you taken a step back and done a little soul searching on things that you may have said that could incite people who are not balanced?
Well, I don't think, look, how do you talk about the threat to democracy, which is real, when a president says things like he says? Do you just not say anything because it may incite somebody? Look, I've not engaged in that rhetoric. Now, my opponent is engaged in that rhetoric. He talks about to be a bloodbath if he loses, talking about how he's going to forgive all the, actually, I guess, suspend the sentences of all those who were arrested and sentenced to go to jail because of what happened to the Capitol.
Yeah, Josh, the Biden gaslighting continues.
Yeah, it really does. And look, one thing that I think it's worth focusing on there, they've used this bloodbath talking point now over and over again. They're saying that Donald Trump is threatening a bloodbath. They're trying to portray this offhand comment as possibly foreshadowing a second January 6th, a nefarious insurrection if Republicans retake over. That comment was made in a very specific context where he was talking about the fact that the auto industry in Detroit, Michigan might face a bloodbath if the Biden administration's feckless policies when it comes to EVs, electric vehicles in China and Mexico are not reversed when he is president. So, they've taken this very, very minor comment and they have disingenuously gaslit the American people into the next coming of Hitler or Mussolini. It's disgusting stuff, absolutely disgusting. But Joe Biden has absolutely positively been just as guilty as MSNBC, as Rachel Maddow, as Joy Reid, as any of the far left commentators here in America. He has been personally just as guilty as any of them when it comes to taking this rhetoric and taking it 10,000 degrees hotter and more fiery than it should be. But unfortunately, this is not an isolated phenomenon. The left has a very long and sordid history in America of taking talking points and then inciting violence from. Unfortunately, this is just the latest and starkest example. But these people, Joe Biden in his Oval Office address Sunday evening here in America, if they are calling for unity and for us to take down the temperature, do us all a favor and look in the freaking mirror. Because if you are not willing to at least do that modest of a step, then just shut up and go home.
Oh, well, you're spot on because, I mean, here are the comments from the White House today. Are they going to stop the inflammatory remarks?
The view is that Trump and the MAGA Republican agenda is a threat to democracy. So how do you get that message across while bringing the temperature down? How is that phrasing going to be replaced? Is it going to be replaced?
Well, look, what I can say is this. We have our differences, and it's okay to have our differences. And it is okay to speak to someone's record, to speak to someone's character.
Josh, Karine Jean-Pierre, they're basically confirming that all the Democrats have is the hateful rhetoric up their sleeves.
Well, you know what's funny is that Democrats are actually starting to concede out in the open that they do not think that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. And the reason that I know that is because you have more and more Democrats, both in the commentator class and the chattering class, as well as the elected official class, who are now just saying that they're fully expecting a Trump win. They know what's happening at this point. To be clear, I mean, the Democrats have a lot of tricks up their sleeves. I don't like this talk that it's all over. We'll see. But he is looking good. Donald Trump's obviously looking good. And you've now seen some op-eds like Jared Golden, a centrist Democrat from Maine, who published an op-ed a couple weeks ago saying Donald Trump's going to win the election and that is okay. And you've actually had an increasingly large number of Democrats actually now say this because they have to run away from Joe Biden on the campaign trail because he's so catastrophically unpopular. But you can't have it both ways. If you are okay with Donald Trump winning an election, then by definition, he is not an existential threat to democracy. You literally just cannot possibly have this both ways. So look, there actually is one movement in America right now that is something of an existential threat to democracy. It is the street thugs and hooligans of the far left. It is the idiots who are out there the day after the inauguration in 2017 under the guise of the so-called Women's March that were vandalizing property and were smashing windows and looting back in Washington, D.C. in 2017. These are the Black Lives Matter Antifa radicals that cost billions and billions of dollars of property damage and untold other number of heinous offenses during the St. George Floyd summer of love in 2020. And then these are the same pro-Hamas people since October 7th that are burning down America's university campuses. So there actually is one movement in America that is a massive, massive existential threat, dare I say, to democracy. It is not Donald Trump. It is not MAGA. It is not America First. It is actually the street thugs of the far left.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Now, look, Donald Trump has had a huge win. A judge has dismissed his indictment over mishandling classified documents.
This is massive news. We did not see this coming at all. This is a case that she tentatively postponed to a later date. The original trial was set for the end of May. She moved it back a couple of months, though not setting a date. She has just dismissed it in a 93-page court document saying that Jack Smith, the special counsel's appointment, violates the appropriations clause and the appointments clause of the United States Constitution.
Josh, explain this decision to us.
So this is a brilliant decision by Judge Cannon. It is vindication for those of us who have been saying exactly this for a while now. Justice Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court recently gave this exact argument a lot of purchase in his concurring opinion in the Trump versus United States, the presidential immunity case that came out a couple weeks ago. So look, the way it works here, you know, you saw the Fox News commentator. We have what's called the appointments clause in Article 2 of our Constitution. Article 2 is what establishes the executive branch. And the appointments clause basically says that there are two types of executive branch appointments. One, there are principal officers, meaning cabinet officials, basically cabinet heads. And for those officers, it's old school advice and consent. So the president nominates and the Senate confirms by a majority vote. Then you have inferior officers, which a cabinet head can appoint on his own initiative, but you still have to be able to do so, quote unquote, by law. That's the constitutional language. Now, the obvious legal question is, does the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, does he have the law to actually, on his own initiative, to unilaterally authorize the creation of a brand new special counsel to investigate the former president of the United States? It turns out that no, he actually does not. If you go and actually look at the statutes that Jack Smith purports to cite to give him the authority to do so, there are 4 or 5 random subsections of other statutes that actually really have nothing whatsoever to do with a special counsel. So the actual authorization is not there. Congress did not authorize him to take this action. So it's really just a straightforward act of separation of powers. And, it's funny because the judge here, Aileen Cannon, here in Florida, where I live, she has been excoriated by the media for the better part of a year now. They've been calling her a MAGA judge, a Trump sycophant, because she's being very slow and steadfast and fastidious and meticulous in all of her various pretrial motions and hearings. But you know what? She has been exactly right, because we are in uncharted waters of uncharted waters here. We're dealing with the first ever prosecution of a former president of the United States, for God's sake. And she's done the correct and courageous thing here. The relevant question that I have right now is whether or not the other district court judge in the other special counsel probe, that'll be Tanya Chutkan in the Washington, D.C. probe, the January 6th case, will she go ahead and now do the exact same thing? That remains to be seen.
Well, we will find out soon, but you're right. Good on her for being so meticulous and coming out with the right outcome. Josh Hammer, good to speak with you. Thanks so much for joining us.